The JD800 is a legendary synthesizer that came out in 1991, and today I'm going to talk to you about my journey. And along the way, I'll go ahead and do some sound demos. So let's go ahead and get started. The story of how I got a JD800 into my studio 33 years after I first saw it really begins back in 1992. Something that you need to understand about 1992 is that there was no internet back then. Okay, not as far as normal people like me were concerned. You know, if you were a scientist or an engineer or a hacker, then maybe you worked with the internet. But most people didn't have access to any kind of usable internet that you could use to find out about gear or do research or buy anything online. There was no Amazon, there was no Guitar Center or Sweetwater or anything like that at that time. So the way that you found out about gear back then, at least for me, was primarily in three different ways. And one of those ways was reading about the gear. So I would get these catalogs in the mail, like this musician's friend right here. And it had a little bit of information about the gear that I was interested in, but it didn't include all the gear. You know, these different companies only sold certain lines of gear, so they may not have had everything. And it was limited on how much they could put in the catalog. So you might have a catalog that's more oriented towards guitar, if you're a guitar player, and you had ordered guitars in the past and guitar equipment, or if you're into recording, you know, maybe you would have got a catalog that was sort of customized, that would have had more of the recording gear. And there was very, very little information in here. But if you did like what you saw, you could buy it by sending them a check, and then you'd receive the gear in the mail several days later. Another way that you could read about gear would have been in a book. This is a book that came out in 1987. And in one section of this book, it actually talks about synthesizers. It talks about synthesizers that were old at that time and synthesizers that were new. But books like this, they were not, you know, completely up to date with the latest stuff. So even though this was published in 1987, it doesn't even mention the Roland D50, which also came out in 1987. And that's because the book was written in 1986. So when they wrote this book, they didn't even know about the D50 more than likely. So in other words, when you read a book about the latest synth gear, it really wasn't the latest. I really enjoyed also reading magazine articles. Now, I can't prove this. I don't have any hard data on it, but I suspect that because a lot of the magazines had relationships with various product companies, that some of the articles were probably biased in favor of the product. So it's possible that the information we were getting wasn't always completely accurate, but they were really fun, like I said, to read. And then you could kind of imagine, since you couldn't see a video, you could kind of imagine a person, you know, actually playing and going through some of the settings. And they usually talked in detail about the specs. So you knew like the size of the instrument, the weight, how many oscillators it had, if it was a synthesizer, multi-timbrality, you know, things like that. So magazines were definitely one of my favorite ways to find out about gear at that time. So the next way that you would learn about gear, which would have been probably the best way, in my opinion, is if you had a friend who owned the gear that you were interested in. So, you know, you wanted to buy something, and you had a friend that had it at their house and would let you either play around with it there at their house, even better than that, if they would let you borrow the gear. So I did get to borrow a couple of synthesizers back then. I remember borrowing a Casio CZ101, which was actually a pretty competent real synthesizer. I know you hear the word Casio and you think of the toys, but that was actually a real synthesizer. Of course, another way that you would learn about gear would be to go to a music store. And going to a music store was quite an event. And in 1992, that's exactly what I did. I remember that it was a cloudy morning when I set off from Altus, Oklahoma, because Altus, Oklahoma, where I lived and worked at the time, it didn't have any stores that carried new synthesizers, not a single one at that time. Now I could drive from Altus, Oklahoma 50 miles away to Lawton, Oklahoma, which did have 2 stores that I can remember. But to get to the really good stores that had the better selection of synthesizers, I had to drive over 100 miles to Oklahoma City. And that's exactly what I did. Back in those days, we planned those trips, and those trips were exciting. You know, you were going to see things, hopefully, that you had never seen before, and get to play with instruments, and hopefully you were going to be able to buy something. You'd find something that you could afford. And I was in my early 20s back then, so there wasn't really a whole lot that I could really afford, but I knew that I might get to see something. So off we headed up to Oklahoma City, over 100-mile drive. And because of the excitement and because of the rarity of us getting to see these types of stores, I remember that my heart would start beating fast, knowing, that I was getting closer and closer to the store. And then, whenever you drove into the parking lot, and the store that I visited that day was a store called Rawson Music. And this video, of course, is not sponsored by anyone at all. So what I remember, just walking across the parking lot, you wanted to walk fast because you were excited. And once you got into the store, if there was a certain area of the store that you wanted to go to, you had to restrain yourself from walking fast over to that section, because it was like, hey, what's over there? What's over there? So this is what I remember. I remember walking up to the synthesizer section, and before I even got there, I saw something that I had never seen before. I had never even heard of it before. And of course that was the JD800. And this is an extremely unique machine. To help you understand why this synthesizer was so different to me that day, I'm going to go ahead and read an excerpt for you out of the owner's manual that explains the philosophy behind the JD800. In the past, all synthesizers were of the analog type. Those synthesizers had lots of knobs, one knob for each function. This meant that the process of making sounds was a visual and fairly intuitive process. These synthesizers emphasized the process of sound creation. As digital technology advanced, digital synthesizers appeared. These synthesizers were able to simulate acoustic instrument sounds that analog machines could not. Overall, digital instruments offered a wider variety of possibilities, but with one major trade-off: sound creation became much more complicated. Today, fewer and fewer people actually create their own sounds and simply play presets or sounds created by programmers. However, the original purpose of the synthesizer was to create sound. It's easy to simply select a preset you like, but that sound will always be someone else's sound. We at Roland asked, why don't we return to the roots of synthesis, the enjoyment of creating original sounds? We considered many different ways in which we could bring back the fun of creating sounds, and the result is the JD800 before you. The JD800 is designed to make it fun to create sounds, so please go ahead and move those sliders. We hope you will make lots of different sounds, original sounds, with which to play your original music. Now that day, I don't remember who I was with. I never made those kinds of trips alone. I just remember seeing this synthesizer. I don't remember any other gear that I looked at. I don't remember what I bought that day. All I know is that I had an encounter, an experience. I was able to sit down and I was actually able to play the JD800, and it left a very strong impression on me. Because this looks a lot like an analog synthesizer, I think it was important for them to put a preset like 12, which is called Massive Pad, that has an analog-like sound to it. That's a pretty big sound. Now we'll go ahead and with that same sound, we'll tweak the filter a little bit. And the filter does go into self-oscillation, in case you're wondering. You can hear that aliasing at the higher resonances and, of course, the higher notes. Now, there was no way that I was going to be able to afford a JD800. At that time, I believe they were selling for around $2,900. And to put that in perspective, just a couple of years before that, I had bought myself a Chevy Camaro in good running shape. Everything worked. It was in good condition. A car that cost me $3,200. So $2,900 in today's US dollars would be roughly the equivalent of $6,500 when you account for inflation. So this synthesizer was not something that, I really thought that I could afford at that time or really anytime soon. And of course, I didn't buy it. I walked away. I thought about it. I thought about it a lot. And then eventually I stopped thinking about it. This sound, Millennium, as its first preset, to me it's not the most exciting preset, but I guess it does kind of show the digital side of this. And for people who are interested in things like the DX7 and the D50, this would have sounded like a familiar sound. So over the years, things in my life happened. I got married, I had a family, I raised my 2 children, and musical equipment and home studios in general for me became a lower priority. I think a lot of you probably are either going through something like that now, or maybe you have gone through some kind of similar situation in the past where family has to come first, not expensive synthesizers. So fast forward though to the year 2020, and we all know what was going on in 2020. It was a time where the conditions were starting to line up for me to have something like this in my life. First of all, I had been divorced for a few years. And for me, divorce was a really good thing, even though I don't recommend it for everyone. For me, it was a positive experience. It opened up doors for me for creativity, for being able to do the things that I really love. And my children were grown. They no longer live with me. Nobody was depending upon me for financial support. And along with that, I was home a lot more, like most of you. So I started watching YouTube videos, and of course I ran across a couple that talked about the JD800. And then I saw that there was a JD800 at another store that's not far from me, a store called Synth that's in New Braunfels, Texas. So I drove over to Synth and I took a look at it, and I almost bought it, but it had a issue with noise where I could hear a very faint, high-pitched noise in the background on every single preset. I didn't know at the time that I could have fixed that issue very easily by opening up the JD800 and just tweaking one of the variable resistors. I didn't learn about that till later. But the time just wasn't quite right for me to buy one. In 2024, I ended up getting a subscription to Roland Cloud. And in Roland Cloud is, of course, among other synthesizers, the JD800 software version. And I really liked it. I really liked it a lot. I thought it sounded really good, and that really rekindled my desire to get my hands on an actual JD800. I still really couldn't find one at the time that was in the local area. I really wanted to buy local because I wanted to, test it out first to make sure that, it was mostly working order, because I know that there's an issue with these with red glue. They call it the red glue issue, where epoxy inside can melt and get all over everything, and it's really difficult to clean that out. So I wanted to check for things like that, and I wanted to see it in person. I did end up buying a JD-800. I even made a video about the JD-800. I do think that that's a great little alternative for a JD-800. And the thing is, it's really small and compact, which is an advantage when it comes to, where you want to put it and where you want to store it. It's a disadvantage when it comes to programming. And again, I actually talk about those kinds of things in my video review that you might want to check out. Not too long after getting the JD-800, I was able to find a cousin of the JD-800, and that is possibly one of the very best sound modules that's ever been put out by Roland, and that is the JD-990. And that is a truly amazing sounding and capable sound module synthesizer. There's so much to that I really need to save that for another video. So about a year after getting the JD-990, I was actually purchasing another cousin of the JD-800, and that was the JV-1080. And while I was talking to Zach, a co-owner of Alamo Music and the same person who made that video that I had watched a couple of years earlier, he casually mentioned that he had a JD800 that needed to be repaired. And it had that red glue issue, but the red glue had been cleaned off. And there were keys that weren't working, but he let me go ahead and take a look at it. And that, of course, was this instrument right here. With that red glue issue and the attempts to repair this, there's several keys on here that are not fully functional right now. Some of them work intermittently, and then the aftertouch does not work. But all the knobs, faders, and buttons, all of the programming does function normally. So Zach gave me a really good deal on it, considering that it wasn't in perfect condition. And I went ahead and bought it. The most important thing for me wasn't that the keys worked, because I know that the aftertouch on a lot of these older Roland synthesizers is not really the best. So by hooking it up to a more capable controller, like this Native Instruments Kontrol S61 Mark III, I can have the kind of aftertouch sensitivity that I really like in my synthesizers. And the most important thing to me was that these knobs, switches, and faders work. And there's two reasons for that. One, of course, is so that I could program the sounds inside of the JD800, but also this can be used to program sounds inside of the JD990. The JD990 does have a few things that this doesn't have that I won't go into right now, but all of the parameters that are shared between the two instruments you can tweak with the front panel here. So that alone to me almost was worth what I paid for this. But fortunately the sounds inside of here do work. The Fantasia sound is found on other Roland instruments. This is the JD800 version of Fantasia. Spun glass is kind of a haunting sound. Mr. Brass. I really love the way that the JD800 is laid out. The attention to detail, the placement of everything, the usage of the two LCD screens I think was really good for the early 1990s, and the feel of the buttons, the quality of the construction, even right here where it has this angled set of buttons on the side, to me was not just a stylistic choice, but also an ergonomic choice, where you kind of sense that they're thinking about the player. They're thinking about the user. They're not just that the buttons are there, but they are ergonomically easier to access. It's just really unique, and there's nothing really quite like it. And although there are synthesizers out there that are better sounding than this, and certainly many that are much more capable than this, it still has a place. It really does. It's still relevant. It's still fun to use, and that's probably the most important thing, that it's fun to use. And you can make sounds with it very quickly. You know, every single sound is made up of 4 different parts, and each of those parts has its own wave, and each of those waves can be assigned to its own envelope. So you've got the different envelopes and the LFOs and aftertouch and most everything you can do independently. The effects are not completely independent. But yeah, I may make another video where I go more in depth into the sound design. That's not the purpose of this video today. Yeah, it's just a great instrument, and I am so happy to have it here in my studio. I really am. It does take up a lot of space, and it is quite heavy. So if you are thinking about getting one of these, you definitely want to pay close attention to the actual dimensions of this thing. And you're not going to want to put it on a keyboard stand that is weak. It needs to be a pretty sturdy stand. That would be my recommendation. In addition to the Roland Cloud version of the JD800 and the JD-800, you've also got the Zencore versions that you can find in the Jupiter X, and also I believe the Juno X may allow you to put those sounds inside of it. And then there's the Roland System 8, which is the ACB technology, where they actually model the circuitry of the JD800, not just the digital parts of it, but also the circuitry. And I've heard that the System 8 ACB version is actually the most accurate reproduction of this. But even the cloud version, to me, is good enough for most situations. It's much, much more practical and, of course, a lot less expensive to use that or the JD-800 and other versions than to go out and actually find one of these. Because it is an older synthesizer, there is going to be some issues. I mentioned the red glue issue and the other issues that I've had with this, and over time I really don't know how long it's going to last. But while it works and while I have it in my studio, I'm really happy to have it available to me. Is this the best sounding synthesizer in my studio? No, not even close. I actually prefer the sound of some of my analog instruments over this. And sitting beside it is the ASM Hydrasynth. I think the ASM Hydrasynth has a lot more capability and expressiveness, but I still really am happy to have this in my studio. Even if I'm not playing it, it's one of those instruments that just to look at it can give you inspiration. If you like this kind of content, I'd really appreciate it if you would consider hitting like and or subscribe. I'd also like to hear your comments, like if you own a JD800 or you've thought about buying a JD800, or reasons why you never did buy a JD800. I'd really be interested to know those kinds of things. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, Have a nice day.